It's a really great pleasure to welcome all of you to this policy forum to introduce this important new volume, Peacebuilding, Power and Politics, edited by Devon Curtis and Gwinyayi Dzinesa. And it's a really particular pleasure to welcome Devon, who is the co-editor of the volume and had been here at then IPA, and who will present the main topics of the volume. And I'd like to also welcome our discussant, Ejevon Otobo, the director and deputy head of the United Nations Peacebuilding Support Office. And as I trust you've all seen, the book is on sale outside this room at the end of the meeting. Well, this is truly an introductory event, an opening to what I regard as an exceptional volume. The volume is the result of two recent seminars which were held in Gaborone, Botswana, and in Cambridge, England recently, and it provides what I would call an intense and searching look at the multiple concepts contained in the word peacebuilding, and examines the experiences and ideas of a wide range of local, national, regional, and international actors in a number of African countries. There are 17 writers, there are 15 chapters, but with the introduction, and one chapter has 2 writers, there are 17 writers who are African, European, Australian, Indian, and American. So the volume offers a variety of academic and field perspectives. And I was struck by one sentence in the introduction that it seemed to me kind of captures the density of the analysis. And Devon writes, the writers in this volume focus on the interaction between local and global ideas and practices in the reconstitution of authority and livelihoods after conflict, showcasing the tensions that occur within and between the multitude of actors involved in the peacebuilding industry, as well as their intended beneficiaries. You can mull that, that's a big sentence. It's got a lot in it. It really does. Interestingly, therefore, peacebuilding in this volume is not presented as an inherently good idea or as a clearly defined pathway to successful post-conflict reconstruction and development. So it kind of really challenges all of us. Peacebuilding is presented instead, in my thought, as a problematic, an idea that has different meanings and potentials for different actors and supposed beneficiaries. As the UN, as you all know, is dealing with peacebuilding in 6 African countries, as well as facing major ongoing and new challenges in Somalia and Mali right now, this really is a most timely discussion. So Devon will share her overview of the volume for about 15 minutes. Mr. Otobo will speak for 7 or 8 minutes as our discussant. We then will have a discussion with your thoughts and some questions for the panel, and we will go on right till 2:45 at the latest. So Devon, thank you again, please.
Thank you. Thank you for such a kind introduction. And I'm really delighted to be back here, to be back in New York, and delighted also to be on this, to be here with Mr. Otobo, who will talk a little bit more about some of the practical challenges, whereas my talk might be a little bit more conceptual. And as John was saying, this volume is really the result of a collaborative project between the University of Cambridge, where I teach, and the Center for Conflict Resolution based in South Africa. And we brought together a number of academics, as John said, from really around Africa and the world, to be discussing peacebuilding, and just the sort of rationale that led to thinking about this, or that led to this volume, really was, I mean, first of all, just Africa being the site of a lot of peacebuilding projects and initiatives and ideas. Of course, the countries on the UN Peacebuilding Commission all African, and also that African institutions were thinking about and are thinking about peace building, post-conflict reconstruction. So the AU and NEPAD both having post-conflict reconstruction frameworks. And also because a number of recent reports, such as the Human Security Report, have pointed out the decline in conflict in Africa, and many attribute this decline to the increase in international efforts to end wars and build peace. So we really thought that because of these developments, it was time to think about what we were doing, what these initiatives were doing. And in the people that were brought together at Cambridge and through the Center for Conflict Resolution, there were very much sort of a diversity of views, of backgrounds. And so some of the academics were very much I would say sort of policy scholars. I mean, trying to think about ways to generate sort of better advice or guidelines to policy, whereas others were very much critical of the entire peacebuilding industry and the very idea of peacebuilding. And so this book is really the result of that conversation between some people that were really trying to provide advice and others that saw peacebuilding as a form at the extreme of neocolonialism and were very critical, seeing peacebuilding as an ideology as opposed to a set of programs. So this book is the result. And in particular, we're interested in this book in thinking about the ways that peacebuilding ideas and initiatives are reinforced or questioned or subverted or reappropriated, redesigned by African actors. So how procedures and processes that are established in one venue or by one institution are subjected to a thorough reworking as they play out in a different venue, in a different setting. And as I said, the contributors to this volume, all 17 of them, have a variety of different approaches, methodologically, theoretically, and so on, but they all share the conviction that peacebuilding isn't something that just happens in the corridors of the United Nations, but also is scripted by African actors as well. So we are focused then on this interaction between local and global ideas and practices, showcasing the tensions that emerge. The book is organized in sort of 3 sections. First of all, we go through a number of different themes, such as sort of peace negotiations, governance state building, DDR, security sector reform. Then a number of authors look at various institutions, so the UN Peacebuilding Commission, the World Bank, IMF, the ICC, and of course the AU, NEPAD, and the African Union and NEPAD. Then the last section of the book looks at various cases of sort of concrete case studies. Now, what I wanted to do for this presentation is not really go through the entire book, but what I wanted to present was really kind of 3 different ways of thinking about peace building and the problems with these frameworks for thinking about peace building, and why I think we need to think of peace building not as a set of procedures or practices that are leading to some universally defined endpoint, but rather as a terrain of contestation with multiple ideas and relationships that are embedded in hierarchies of power and knowledge. And while I go through these 3 different ways of thinking about peace building, I'll try to bring up some examples from the book that various chapter authors talked about. But I think just one thing to keep in mind as I go through is questions of peace building are not new questions. So things such as how to reestablish political authority and security after violence, what to do about ex-combatants, how to manage changed social relations and the mistrust that frequently accompanies violence, what to do about changed patterns of livelihood and production. These are questions that have been addressed in a myriad of different ways in different African locales over time. So, for instance, Shaka, the Zulu chief and state builder in the early 19th century, he didn't allow military regiments to marry until after they left their regiments and set up homesteads. So this was typically in their late 30s for men and 20s for women. So this transition from a fighter to a civilian, question of what to do with ex-combatants, that was resolved through the social institution of marriage. So this concern that the UN has today, the UN and other international institutions have today, of this transition from fighter to civilian, was an issue, of course, in various locales across Africa over time. So this peacebuilding is not a new preoccupation, but after the end of the Cold War, it has emerged as a distinctive area of policy intervention. So, of course, the Agenda for Peace. And since 1992, so since the Agenda for Peace, we do see this expansion of peacebuilding activities, especially with notions of positive peace, human security. The target of peacebuilding, not only the state and its institutions, but also individuals, local communities. And you see this proliferation of institutions that are tasked with peacebuilding, both international and at the continental level. And you also see this huge increase in peacebuilding scholarship. So the number of new journals that have been created since the end of the Cold War that are focused on peacebuilding, post-conflict reconstruction, governance, we haven't seen this number of new academic journals since actually the 1950s and 60s, when peace studies emerged as a discipline. And I think it's really interesting to see how academic scholarship is kind of following, in a sense, following changes in the policy world. Okay, so back to the book. In the book, we talk about then three ways or three frameworks through which we can think about peacebuilding and their shortcomings. And these three views make really important normative assumptions about the nature of peace and about the identity and the motivations of peacebuilders. And these lead to very different conclusions about peacebuilding and about priorities. So the first, liberal peacebuilding, or liberal governance as peacebuilding. Now, a lot of the peacebuilding scholarship positions itself within this liberal tradition or against it. So under this view, peacebuilding is a project of liberal governance, and you find this in an Agenda for Peace and in much of the UN programming for peacebuilding. Here, liberal peacebuilding, then, it's a normative. It's both a normative agenda and it's a framework for understanding these diverse activities and initiatives to promote peace in Africa. So multi-party, electoral democracy, and a market economy are seen as inherently peaceful and desirable. Liberal governance is assumed to have universal relevance, where techniques from one part of the world can be applied in another part of the world with some adaptations to suit local context. The problem, of course, is many of the experiences of countries that are emerging from conflict don't correspond to these liberal predictions. For advocates of liberal peacebuilding, these problems don't have to do with the failure of liberal peace per se, but rather problems with sequencing, the order through which these activities are promoted, or insufficient attention to local context. But people that take this view don't fundamentally question the content of liberal peacebuilding, don't fundamentally question the end point. And this view, liberal peacebuilding, is a very powerful view. And you see this in a lot of practice and actually in a lot of the critical scholarship. And several chapters in the book explore the tensions that emerge out of liberal peacebuilding. So David Keene's chapter, for instance, looks at peace as an incentive for war. He looks at the incentives for further violence that may be established by peace agreements, and explores some of the debates around inclusivity in peace negotiations and some of the debates there. Paul Omak also does a similar thing when he's looking at DDR programs and debates over who is a combatant and why certain people are labeled combatants and why others may not be. A second way of thinking about peacebuilding that we talk about in the book is, instead of thinking of peacebuilding as liberal governance, peacebuilding as stabilization. This shares a liberal concern with order and stability. But while this view acknowledges that there's a multitude of activities and initiatives under a peacebuilding umbrella, the rationale for these activities is to maintain global security and stability. And language here is indicative. If you think about peacekeeping missions today, there's stabilization missions. If you think about units in different governments, stabilization units, this, again, it's a new kind of language. The emphasis is on stable, secure states with well-policed borders. This view shares many of the same assumptions and preoccupations as peacebuilding, as liberal governance, but it has less faith in the possibilities for transformation and for socialization. So if outsiders see part of the sort of problem in Africa as the attachment to various parochial identities, ethnic or otherwise, peacebuilding as stabilization tends to control the expression of these identities, whereas the liberal governance view tries to transform these identities and has more faith in sort of possibilities for socialization. Under a peacebuilding as stabilization view, low-intensity conflict may be seen as inevitable, as long as this doesn't affect international order and international stability. And paradoxically, increased militarization and military solutions then comes to be seen as part of peacebuilding. So militarization as peacebuilding is part of this view. Now, other scholars who see peacebuilding as stabilization are much more critical of this and say that this is reminiscent of previous forms of external domination, disguised imperialism, a cover for the political and economic interests of the West. And there's a chapter in the book by Ebo Hutchful on security sector reform that criticizes this view and that talks quite a lot about the differences between democratic security sector governance and some of the security sector reform programs. Now, the third view, the last view that I'll talk about, is peacebuilding as social justice. This is put forward by those who think that the previous two views put too much emphasis on the maintenance of order. So while a liberal governance view, liberal governance does this through state institutions and through the market, and whereas peacebuilding as stabilization does this through militarization, both are concerned with order and stability. But others believe that peacebuilding should focus on issues of inequality and structural violence. That peacebuilding as social justice then would address international inequalities as well as inequalities within countries. The chapter on the Niger Delta by Oyefusi takes this perspective. But there's big disagreements within this view as to who are the agents then of peacebuilding. And a key question, and one that maybe will come up within the discussion, is whether African-level institutions reflect similar kinds of knowledge as Western-based institutions. The authors very much disagreed on this point. But devolving responsibility to African governments will not necessarily achieve social justice or to satisfy the transformative aspirations of local groups. So if you see peacebuilding as social justice, whose version of social justice? Who are the agents of social justice? These are key questions. The chapter in the book by Dominic Zaum, called The Conundrums of State Building and Local Ownership, highlights this tension. He says that a key part of many peacebuilding programs is local ownership. But for local ownership to have the emancipatory effect that's identified in a lot of the sort of peacebuilding reports, it must go beyond government ownership and the co-option of local elites. And instead, he says, must involve the participation of a wider and more inclusive range of social groups. But this requires first identifying the groups and developing new mechanisms for inclusion. And that requires international or continental actors from making fundamentally political decisions and intervening deeply, so putting a very heavy footprint. So there's this contradiction between sort of local ownership that tries to have sort of a light footprint, and then the heavy footprint that's required for a much deeper transformation. So, and Comfort Arrow in her chapter on West Africa looks at some of these tensions. Okay, so we have these different views, these three different views. Where do we go from here? And I suppose just one thing to emphasize is that these three frameworks that I've discussed are not mutually exclusive, of course. So the UN and the AU use the language of all three. the same agency can have a normative commitment to social justice, but can encourage stabilization or liberal governance. But it does lead to different priorities, and there are tensions between them. So despite this common term of peacebuilding, different agencies do tend to prioritize different types of activities, often depending on organizational mandates and interests. And so some authors reject these frameworks entirely and say that, that one needs to uncover peacebuilding alternatives in local societies, within the informal economy, within religious groups, community groups. So that's why I suppose our project, instead of seeing peace as an end point, sees it as a zone of contestation. And what's then interesting is to understand what happens when these various peace-building logics come into contact with one another and come into contact with the realities on the ground. So most of the authors in the volume are ultimately skeptical of views or solutions that look to better sequencing or better coordination as the issue, because there are competing views of what peacebuilding is and what it's meant to achieve. So for instance, Christopher Clapham, his chapter on Somalia shows the futility of a peacebuilding through state-building approach in Somalia, and says that the engagement of external actors in Somalia intensified conflict rather than moderating it. And it led to further factionalism in Somali society as leaders sought to present themselves as independent operators in order to get a seat at the peacebuilding table. And Sarah Nawin does a similar thing when looking at the ICC and different ideas of justice and peace that are at stake there. So just finally then, I think that the book really exposes a lot of the tensions that are at the heart of peacebuilding. I'm not sure that these tensions can be resolved. There's no denying that conflict in Africa has enormous costs, and the horrors of that violence urge us towards an imagined shared alternative called peace. When international programs seem to be insufficient, we look towards African institutions. But I suppose the message that this book tries to make is that peace isn't something to be discovered and it's not something to be imposed, but it's a set of different and continually contested practices where the very meaning of peace and peacebuilding is constantly being negotiated. And masking this very subjective nature of peace, I think, disguises the ideology and relations of power that are behind it. So I suppose then, ultimately, instead of prescribing a route to peace, this book has a much more humble goal, I think, of trying to be aware and trying to illuminate some of the various interests and ideas and views that are involved in peacebuilding. Thanks.
Well, Devon, thank you very much. That was a very succinct summary of a very dense set of considerations and arguments, again, by a very wide range of authors, many of whom are not here at the United Nations. So our discussant is Mr. Otobo, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hirsch, for giving me the floor. First of all, let me begin by saying that when I read the book, one of the things that struck me was these three normative, prescriptive frameworks that Devon has just explained in peacebuilding. The liberal, peacebuilding as a liberal adventure, peacebuilding as stabilization, and peacebuilding as social justice. However, when you turn to page 22 to 23 of the book did something more practical, and it's along those lines I'm going to speak, which is there are three strands of literature in peacebuilding, which do not necessarily reflect the more ideological orientation that is described in terms of those three schools. But before telling you what those three strands are, there was something in the book on page 2 which struck me. You read parts that struck you, but there was something towards the bottom of page 2 of the book that struck me, which was something to the effect that among the authors, 17 of them, there is no consensus on the roles, aims, and effects of peace-building initiatives in Africa. Now, this is a very remarkable comment if you come to think of it very closely after all that work. Now, so what are the three strands of literature in peace-building if you strip the ideological aspect, which is what I want to do in the first part of my presentation. The three strands in the literature is that in some cases, which is what the first part of the book tried to do, they grapple with what you call the definition and conceptual issues of peace building. This is where people ask the question, is peace building the same thing as state building and nation building? If not, how are they different? Is peace building the same thing as conflict-sensitive analysis? By the way, on this, Devon, there is in Cambridge, where you live, a group which is called the CDA Collaborative Project. And that group there is a staff member there who put out an analysis recently where he made the point that peace building and conflict sensitivity are not the same thing. That conflict sensitivity just means that do no harm and maximize the opportunities for peace. Whereas by contrast, peace building tells you that you should go and put the structures for managing and handling peace. And in fact, if you look at the first definition that Boutros Ghali offered in the Agenda for Peace, that was precisely what they focused on. And if you look at the 2000 review by Brahimi, he made the point that the difference between peacekeeping and peace building is that in the peacekeeping mode, the peacekeepers who are normally external actors are substituting their resources for that of the state. But in the peace-building mode, what makes it different from peacekeeping is that in that mode, they are building the capacity of governments to do two things. One, to be able to manage some of the peace-building processes, but more importantly, to put in place structure. So this question of structure and institutions is key. And on that point, there is a recent publication that came out. I'm sure most of you who are in the peace-building community will have seen it. It's called Peacebuilding 2.0. Mapping the boundaries of an expanding field. This is put out by the Alliance for Peacebuilding in Washington. And what it tried to do is to grapple with these definitional issues. So that is the first strand of literature on peacebuilding. The second strand of the literature on peacebuilding is institutions. And here the big question is, what are the type of institutions that we need to put in place for peacebuilding to succeed? And here there are three categories here. One is, what type of structure should government put in place, as I was saying, to make peace building succeed in order to transmute the whole process of conflict resolution to be an internal thing without much external actor participation, the capacity to manage it. The second one is institutions for decision making, both especially at the international level, and this is where the Peace Building Commission comes in. And by the way, there is one of my articles that I presented recently at the Global Governance Institute in Brussels. It's going to be circulated later, where I grapple with the whole issue of the institutional making of PBC up to date from the time it was established till now, and I think you will find it interesting. And finally, there are the question of institutions for financing, because ultimately, no matter how robust and reasonable your projects are, until you have some mechanism for funding what you have agreed or decided or negotiated in peace agreements, nothing will come out of it. And the third strand is what I call where the rubber hits the road, namely, what are the actions in practice, when peace building in practice. And part 3 of this book actually deals with much of that, and I'm going to comment about some of the chapters later. But before I do that, I want to spend my second section at the request of the organizers to speak a little bit about the work of the Peace Building Commission, of which I'm in the secretariat that services it. If you look at the role that was envisaged for the Peace Building Commission, especially if you take a very critical look of paragraph 2 of the resolution that set up the Peace Building Commission, you will easily discover that there were 3 roles assigned to the Peace Building Commission. The first role is what I broadly call political accompaniment and advocacy. That is the A. In fact, I have this mnemonic called ARC, A-R-O-C, to describe the role. And the second role that is given to the Peace Building Commission, for which it has been judged fairly harshly, even though it is making more progress now, is the whole question of resource mobilization. Because it was recognized that no matter how much the PBF will have, the Peace Building Fund, which is one of the 3 legs of the so-called new addition to the peace building architecture, there was recognition by the drafters of the resolution that the Peace Building Commission will have to play a very significant role. And the third role that was assigned to it is fostering coherence among the multiplicity of actors in the field, because as you know, there are, quite frankly, a lot of actors in the field in the countries that we are involved in. So the question is, on these three key issues, what is the record? And I will say that on the political accompaniment, that is where I will put the institution building. I'm sure most of you will be aware that one of the flagship effort that we have made in Liberia, which is the penultimate country on the agenda of the PBC, is to help the country to build what we call the security and justice hubs. The big idea behind the security and justice hubs is to be able to decentralize state authority from Monrovia, because up till now, and in fact up till the war and up till now, 10 years, because this year marks the 10th anniversary of the Accra Peace Accord, Comprehensive Peace Accords that ended the Liberian crisis after so many rounds of negotiations. One of the things that we have found is that the government is still heavily reliant on the peacekeeping mission there. And in the letter from the Security Council in 2010, when Liberia was referred to us, one of the things that was explicitly stated in that letter is that the PBC engagement should help in that transition. And the Peacebuilding Commission in Liberia has decided to focus on three things. Not three priorities. The three priorities are well stated, three things to make a difference. And the first one that we have focused on, for which the hub was inaugurated 17th of February, was to have this, to develop 5 hubs to serve the 15 counties. So there is one hub for each county. The first hub that has been opened in Banga, as you may know, was the capital of Charles Taylor's rebellion, is serving 3 counties. It's serving the county of Lofa, Nimba, and Bong. Actually, Banga is located in the Bong County. And the big idea behind the hub is to be able to have the citizens of Liberia who are located in these 3 counties to have access to justice. So in this hub is both a physical and institutional expression of the government's capacity to put justice to the access of the people. So there are 4 big institutions in each of these hubs, which the Peacebuilding Fund has built the initial one at the cost of approximately $7 million US. And in each of these hubs, you have the courts, you have the police, formed police units that will be operating from there. You have the Bureau of Immigration, and also you're going to have over time some prison services. And the whole idea is to be able to extend these services to the people in these 3 hubs. So that is something we have done as a flagship. The second thing that we are getting involved in, and it's one of the issues that people have talked about, that we should not go so much into the infrastructure, is helping the government to think through and design its reconciliation strategy. Because at the heart of the conflict in Liberia were deep fissures within that society between what you call the indigenous Liberians and the Congo people. The Congo people, by the way, as the Minister of Justice told the PBC in one of the meetings, is a mixture of both the African-American Liberians that were freed and settled in the place, because it has always struck me why they call these people the Congo people, and the people from other African countries, mostly from Congo, who were settled also in Monrovia and the hinterland. So the deep fissure around these issues is one of the areas that we are trying to help the government to think through. And the third flagship activity that the Peacebuilding Commission has in Liberia is the whole question of how do we support rule of law, broadly speaking. And in this, training the police is key to this whole effort, because the police record has been very bad in terms of what they do and what they are not able to do. On resource mobilization, I'm just going to give a few illustrations. On resource mobilization, which is an area, as I said, have been criticized. In the past few years after the 2010 review, one of the things that the Peacebuilding Commission, the Peacebuilding Support Office has done is to outline a strategy for resource mobilization. And last year, we had a very successful donor conference in Geneva for the Burundi configuration. We were able to mobilize a total of 2.6 billion to support the Burundi second generation of PRSP. This was under the Swiss, because the Switzerland is leading the effort, is the chair of the configuration on Burundi. Now, my third and last part will focus on some of the chapters as an illustration of what I was calling the rubber hitting the road, the real concrete action of peace building. And I'm going to mention three chapters. The first chapter that I read and confirmed my impression about how complicated peace building is one of the chapters that Devon made. This was the chapter on security sector governance as peace building. And that chapter did reveal the complexity. And in fact, two of the striking things about the chapter, three of the striking things that the chapter said was the whole notion of how inclusive security sector governance should be, but the relative role that it assigned to four bodies, namely the executive arm to determine policy, the legislature to be responsible for oversight, as well as the civil society to be able to have a broad oversight of what is happening in that sector. And that up till now, people are focused on the mechanical aspect. And by the way, this is the growing view within DPKE itself. The second chapter, which I also read, is the chapter on Niger Delta. And there is an article that I've written on Niger Delta that will be circulated. And that chapter confirms three valid points about the Niger Delta. One, and this also reflected in the piece that I wrote for one of the newspapers in Nigeria, that the fundamental crisis about the Niger Delta has not been addressed by the amnesty that was granted by the government in 2009. Secondly, that the region, the Niger Delta region, which consists of 9 states out of the 36 in Nigeria, remains heavily militarized even after the amnesty. And one wonders then what is the effect of the amnesty. But finally, it makes the important point that were the amnesty to succeed, the amnesty represents an indigenous effort. It has not involved any foreign involvement. It's something that the government designed and they're implementing. And my final comment will pertain to the chapter on the Peacebuilding Commission, because that chapter raises a number of issues which I thought I should address. It raised 5 issues that people need to be aware of. It argued that the Peacebuilding Commission had not been given the mandate of tackling what he called pre-conflict and preventive diplomacy. Of course, I made the point recently at a meeting I was attending that there are few institutions that give themselves the mandate. The mandate that the Peacebuilding Commission is given came from the General Assembly and the Security Council. And the whole idea of exercising out the pre-conflict mandate was between the point when the panel on high-level panel on threats, challenges, and change was written, and when Kofi Annan wrote his report. In the high-level panel, they had envisaged a peace-building commission having that role. But when the negotiations started, they knew that it would not sustain because, first of all, the Security Council believed that was an encroachment, and some of the developing country members were not very amused with that. The author also makes the point that, and here I will dispute that point, that the African voice in the Peacebuilding Commission is not commensurate with the fact that all the countries on the agenda are African countries. And I looked at the data, and this is the last point I'm going to make. The current members of the Peacebuilding Commission, there are 31 members, as all of us know. And 7 out of these 31 members are from Africa. So these are approximately 23%. And this tracks even the broader membership in the General Assembly, because there are 54 members in the General Assembly and there are 193. So the African membership there is 27. In fact, I've made the point elsewhere at a forum in South Africa that were the African voice in the Peacebuilding Commission to be replicated in other forum, that would be quite significant. I will leave it at this point for that question, but I thought I should address some of these issues in the various chapters. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. So we've had kind of an overview of the volume and some commentary from the inside of the PBC. And again, there's a lot for all of you to pull in. It took me a lot going through that introduction, so I don't say that in a negative way. But again, Devon and the co-editor, have highlighted these themes about liberal governance as peacebuilding, peacebuilding as stabilization, and peacebuilding as social justice, and tried to draw some contrasts of perception as to what peacebuilding is all about, and not making an assumption within the volume that it's just a wonderful enterprise. So, I'd like to invite a few of you to make a brief comment. We're going to start with Shazia here. If you would stand up and introduce yourself, and anybody else who'd like to come in. So we'll take 2 or 3 at once. And since so many of you are working on this, I can't imagine that you don't have a question or 2 to ask while we have the opportunity to have both Devon and Ioveme with us here. So Shazia.
Shazia Rafi, Secretary General of Parliamentarians for Global Action. I'd just like, since I haven't read the volume, I'm sort of asking this as a question and will be reading it later. Does it cover at all the role that legislatures, both as institutions as well as legislators, have played in peace building, both at the national level, through regional organizations, and also there have been international work done by parliamentarians under what our organization calls Parliamentary Diplomacy, or what we also call track 1.5. Since it's not quite the track 1 of governments, it's not the track 2 of NGOs, but yet teams of legislators have worked across Africa in particular. And I note that you're going to be doing a book on Burundi. In Burundi, it was quite a successful effort of several projects and missions done jointly with the UN between 93 and 98. So, and they cover both stabilization as well as building good governance structures and to some extent social justice, since the work on the ICC was also started by legislators. And Senegal, being the first country that ratified it, in a certain sense, set the marker of what the international legislators were expecting from post-conflict peace and justice. So I'd be interested in your comments on that. And also from Mr. Otobo, in terms of how those efforts in the countries that are under the PBC with the legislature have developed since then.
So parliamentary and legislative efforts as part of peace building.
And the results of that.
And the results thereof. So, Charlie, please introduce yourself.
Charles Cater, Security Council report. Your mention of the Somalia case study piqued my curiosity, in particular the risks of international intervention and externally driven state building as peace building. Did Christopher Clapham get into what the alternatives might be in Somalia, or extrapolate from the Somalia case study more broadly?
Okay, would somebody else like to come in here? The lady in the back there, please introduce yourself.
Haubin, and I have an online column at taz.de, which is the website of Die Tageszeitung. And my question for Dr. Curtis is, I wondered how important reconciliation and the South African model of the truth and reconciliation is in the peace building situation, and how much is that treated in the book? And for Mr. Otobo, I would appreciate hearing more about what's happening in Liberia with the reconciliation. I was glad to hear that you mentioned it, and wondered how that's proceeding and what the problems and what the strengths are of that.
So would any of the authors regard the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa as a successful example of peace building? Or not. And of course, it's much more problematic in Liberia. So has this been a useful initiative in Liberia, given the lack of resources and the, contestation, to use that word, that's continued in Liberia? So would anybody else like to come in right now? So one more, this gentleman, okay. And please introduce yourself. Here comes the mic. You're in luck.
Thanks. Simon Billett from the UK mission to the UN, where I'm a peacebuilding advisor. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the 3 sort of types of peacebuilding you mentioned, and how each impacts on the connection between peacebuilding and development, which we spend a lot of time talking about here in New York. Thanks.
Did you get it?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to our panel, and then we'll have another round here. So please.
Yeah, I guess I'll take those. Oh, sorry. I'll take those in turn. I mean, first of all, the role of legislatures. I mean, we didn't cover that as a thematic chapter. I guess I should have said, I mean, in a volume like this, there are a large number of gaps. I mean, so it's not at all an attempt to be sort of a comprehensive statement on peace building in Africa. I mean, that would have been thousands and thousands of pages, I think. So instead, what we tried to do is to sort of pick out certain themes and then institutions and then cases to show this kind of connection between local and global ideas and how they conflict and how they're reinterpreted. But I think your point about legislatures is a really important one, and it does come up to a certain extent in several of the case study chapters. And so even though it's not one of the sort of thematic chapters, although really it could be, I mean, I think that it's a really interesting point. I mean, in terms of opposition and the role of the legislature in accountability and so on. So it does come up in case studies, but not as a sort of distinct kind of area that we looked at. Although actually the chapter on state building by Dominic Zahn also does bring that up as, in a sense, as a potential sort of alternative or something that some of these state building programs might want to think about. So I think that's a really good point. On Somalia, yes. So in a sense, Clapham does raise a couple of alternatives, but in a sense, he looks at sort of the alternative of Somaliland, I suppose, as Somaliland not having the same kind of external intervention, although he's very careful to make very sort of generalized claims on the basis of the Somaliland experience. And then he also discusses the Union of Islamic Courts as something that, in a sense, is co-opted globally. So it's an example of what he sees as kind of a homegrown movement initially, that is then linked up to global networks, and then, of course, is perceived as a threat by some other international countries. And then there's, of course, the Ethiopian invasion. But I suppose just as a potential alternative, that there are different ways of thinking about social cohesion or how society can be governed that lie outside this notion of kind of the sort of liberal state building practices. Yet he's, again, very careful to, he's certainly not saying that the Union of Islamic Courts is an alternative that would have worked had it not been broken off. I think the larger point in terms of sort of the general, what he's saying more generally about Somalia is that there's a danger to see peace building as being achieved through state building, that state building is not a route towards peace building, that in fact those fundamental questions of what is peace, what is it that we want our society to look like, has to come before state building initiatives. So state building isn't a route in itself to peace. Reconciliation, the TRC, so again, like the legislature, this isn't something that the volume looks at directly. And in fact, in a sense, it would, I suppose the message of the volume is that although one can learn from experiences in different countries, that the idea of being able to take something like the TRC in South Africa and apply it in another African locale is going to be problematic because it's going to be a very different social and political and economic context. And so, yes, there's things that can be learned, but that's in a sense what the volume is trying to sort of argue against these models being used and transmitted. And just the last question then, peace building and development. Yeah, that's interesting. I suppose both, certainly a liberal governance view would very much buy into the sort of there's no security without development, no development without security. I mean, development being a means, the sort of peace building as order, development is a key component of that. And I think it's only the third way of thinking about peace building as social justice. Development, of course, is also important if we think about peace building as social justice, but it's a different kind of development. It's development that is thinking about issues of equality and justice. Who does development benefit? There's always winners and losers. There's always winners and losers from peace. There's winners and losers from development. Who are the beneficiaries? And if you see peace building in that liberal governance framework or stabilization, it's going to lead to quite different kind of development policy than if you see peace building as social justice.
Yeah, thank you. The question from Sazi about parliamentary efforts, I can give you two. One positive, the other not very positive. The not very positive was Sierra Leone, where at some point there we believed there was the need to do some parliamentary capacity building, training, and the rest of things. And the PBF, they put some money out. To our surprise, when we later got the evaluation report, we were told that the MPs did not go for the training. Instead, they sent their staff members, which was not the idea. So that was an example where it was non-positive. In the case of Burundi, however, there was a very sustained effort to support them in their peace-building effort. With respect to Liberia, this is where things are at the moment. The government, with the encouragement and support of the Peacebuilding Commission, has come up with what they call a roadmap for national reconciliation. That roadmap is linked to a program which is Liberia's program to become a medium income by 2030, which is called Liberia Rising. But in the meantime, they have a short-term 5-year program, which is called the Agenda for Transformation. Now, these are the things that they are now working on at present. There are many other things. They are working on how do they deal with the issues of their national symbol. Because one of the most provocative national symbol that we have encountered, and which most of you will have heard about, is the Liberia motto itself. In the motto, it says that the love for freedom brought us here. And that was written by the freed American Liberian slaves who went to the country. And this has offended indigenous Liberians. So replacing the symbols and mottos is one of the early things they are working on. The second thing they are working on is developing historical archive to be able to archive some of the things. And the next issue which they are tackling also is land, because land is at the heart of some of the issues in Liberia, because the American Liberians had disproportionate share of the land compared to the indigenous area. And in terms of the efforts, in addition to helping them, working with UNDP to think through, we're also encouraging them, and we have promised that funding will be given to them from PBC and PBF efforts, is to be able to link the government with a few countries that have undertaken successful national reconciliation, and the government is very much open to this. So those are some of the early steps that we are taking. It's going to be a long process, but these are some of the early steps that we are taking with the government of Liberia. Yeah.
Your comments about rethinking the symbols on the flag sort of reminds me indirectly of an article today in the paper. This is the 100th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg, and there's a fantastic article this morning about the letters that soldiers wrote home to their families at the time, which all invoke patriotism and moral duty and obligation, and which are juxtaposed with the more different kind of letters now. I will let you read the article to sort of draw your judgments. But it was a fantastic article about how symbols of significance change over time in all kinds of countries. So I'd like to do another round. I have a couple of questions for each of you, but I'd like, first of all, to get anybody else here who wants to weigh in to ask something. I realize you've not had the opportunity to read the book, but you've been given kind of a very succinct overview here of what's going on. Jeffrey? I mean, I saw you waving your hand.
Jeff Laurenti with the Century Foundation. I wonder, Devon, if you could explain a bit what those who are adherents of what you describe as that third current, social justice current, think is the relative importance of actually having some degree of security and peaceableness. That sometimes it is the quest for what some perceive as the need for social justice that will have led to the breakdown of peace in the first place. And to what extent do folks of this school feel a preoccupation with guaranteeing the sovereignty of whoever is going to be sitting in the presidential palace? I mean, this is the problem that the Peacebuilding Commission still has not fully solved. When these conflicts are still before the Security Council, you have an international stake and some degree of potential pressure and coercion when you formally recognized a new political authority and accede to its supposed sovereign claims, then if that sovereign authority is going to, if I may use the vernacular, screw its opponents and undo the peace deal, what traction do you have? So are these really starry-eyed, naive folks in your third current who don't see these realities?
Would somebody else like to come in here and make a comment or ask a question or offer an observation? So, let me ask you two questions, Devon, and then I'll ask you two questions.
Okay, good.
All right. So I'm being very even-handed here. You write that there's really an incredible sentence here, but it's kind of what you've already said, that being cognizant of the wide range of interests and views involved in peace building leads to questions about whether peace building should continue to be described primarily as a force for good. Should it continue to be described primarily as a force for good? This is in the book on page 24. So do any of the authors explicitly state that peace building in one or another case study is not a force for good? And could you explain kind of the context? And then you made a kind of an overview here about this matter with regard to social justice of identifying groups, finding ways to involve groups below the level of the state. So how is that, and you said that's kind of intrusive to do that. So, I mean, do you have an example where that's been tried and failed, or been tried and worked? Just to amplify this very briefly, in my course at Columbia, I talk about the huge gap between all the instruments of the African Union and ECOWAS, human rights, democracy, et cetera, and how people don't identify with these things in Africa because there's a gap between all the officials in all these institutions and the man in the street, to put this very broadly. So what do your studies have to say? And I'm going to ask you the same questions I asked you in Cape Town 7 months ago. So is peace building only for small African countries? Or will there ever be, to your analysis, the likelihood of any other country in any other part of the world that's likely, and in either way, why this way or that way? And then is anybody going to graduate from the Peacebuilding Commission now or in the next 6 months to a year? You and I had that brief discussion. You actually hinted, without telling us, that what particular country was going to graduate.
Okay.
Anybody else want to weigh in here? I want to raise all of your opportunities here. So why don't you take those on?
Thanks. I think I'm going to take your second question to me with, is it Jeffrey's question?
Right,
because
okay.
in a sense, they're getting at a similar problem. I mean, is peace a social justice, especially when you're involving kind of community groups and other groups from society that may have been marginalized or excluded in the past? Is this just a sort of starry-eyed enterprise? And I suppose that, this is a long-standing debate, right, in peace studies. I mean, if you think back to the debates in the 60s of those who were talking about structural violence and the need to end structural violence, and that peace was about the end to structural violence, not just the end to direct physical violence. These people, some of them were certainly not just starry-eyed, because in fact some of them were advocating the use of violence, this gets to the second bit of your question, in order to overturn or to get at some of these structures of structural violence. So think about the anti-apartheid movement or liberation struggles. So it's a big debate in peace studies. Is it ever all right to use violence in order to address issues of structural violence, such as then anti-colonial or anti-apartheid movements? Was the use of force justified in those cases? So I don't think that these people are necessarily starry-eyed, because the trade-offs and the dilemmas are very much there. Now, I'm not at all advocating on behalf of the groups you're talking about, to use the force, but But I think people are aware that this is rather difficult. Now, the sort of sovereignty bit of that question is also, this is why it's so difficult to come up with kind of practical recommendations, because you see these contradictions. I mean, I think in the case of Burundi, which is the case I look at the most closely, you see in peacebuilding, you see these different voices. You have the sort of liberal governance people, you have the sort of diversity of views, social justice, all of these different programs. Ultimately, when it comes right down to it, people have agreed with a sort of peacebuilding as stabilization, increased militarization, and increased sort of authoritarianism. And that's, in a sense, been allowed to happen because people want Burundi to be stable. No, the last thing anybody wants is renewed open violence in Burundi. And so some of the goals that were there in the mid-2000s, I think, have been kind of sidelined. And I think we do see very much this tension, this dilemma, and also the problem that it's a sovereign government, and then to what extent can internationals really interfere in that. So I think this really is a dilemma. Force for good. Can we really think about peacebuilding in some non-ideological terms? I suppose I think peacebuilding is an ideology, or the way that we tend to think about peacebuilding is a particular ideology in that it reflects certain ideas of peace. Is it a force for good or not? Well, it depends who you are. It depends on, and this gets back to sort of the three different ways of thinking about this. If we ultimately end up with peacebuilding as stabilization, increased militarization as a form of peacebuilding, that brings about security, order, but not everybody is a beneficiary of that kind of peace. So there are always winners and losers. It very much depends on who you are. So that's why I suppose I would be wary of saying that this is clearly a force for good.
Well, it is worth everybody mulling that over, because the usual operating assumption, not just in the PBC, but in this whole city around here, these 15 blocks near the UN, is that the peacebuilding is a force for good. Why else would there be anything called peacebuilding? But what you really, I think, you say they're winners and losers, which I also think is true. So this requires sort of a more careful look in particular cases, who's doing well and not doing well in Darfur, who's doing well and not doing well in Somalia or in the Congo, and so on. So it's a real set of issues. So, please.
Yes, so
And you can comment on that too.
So you brought our conversation from Cape Town now to New York. Well, your questions are two different sides of the coin, the entry issues and the exit issues. On the entry issues, as you know, there are specific routes as well as what you would call motivations for coming on the agenda, and that's not something that we have much control about. If you read the Economist article about the coming into the agenda of the PBC by Guinea, it was very startling in terms of what they said, which in some ways did show that, in fact, countries sometimes feel the need to come and ask for this instrument to provide it international support. So it's not that it's only going to be small African countries. There is a whole theory that I can share with you in terms of what some of those motivations may be, but this is not the first. In terms of graduation, yes, in fact, we are very advanced. We are going to have, we are just completing a paper, a scenario-based analysis of graduation from the PBC. And in the next 6 weeks, we are going to have a seminar that is going to be jointly sponsored by the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. So we are very much advanced in that. And I think by this time next year, we should be having one of the countries graduating. Yeah.
That was the promise a little while ago, but if it's a year coming, it's still coming. So somebody's going to graduate.
Yeah, somebody's going to graduate. Yeah.
Okay.
These things take time.
Right.
Yeah.
I understand.
You know, it's like marriage and divorce. They are not very easy.
Je comprends.
Je comprends maintenant.
Yeah, come on in. Go ahead.
Just back to that you raised about alternatives. I mean, one of the other alternatives that a couple of authors mention in terms of, are there alternatives then to the way that we tend to think about peace building? And that's illiberal peace building. And so there are countries, Rwanda, arguably Ethiopia, Eritrea, Angola, that actually peace building could be characterized as illiberal peace building, sort of high modernist development, and there's clearly some sort of normative trade-offs when we see this as an alternative, and also I think there's limited. We can't really transfer the experience of those countries to a place like Somalia, and what's interesting is a lot of Rwanda. Ethiopia, Eritrea, these are former rebel movements. There are quite interesting parallels, I think, between these countries. But it is mentioned as a possible alternative to sort of Western-driven, liberal-style peace building. So I'll just put that out there as well in terms of controversial comments.
So would somebody else like to come in here before we close this off? You all could have gotten your good sense of what the challenges and dilemmas of peace building. Murray. And again, could you just identify yourself? I think 95% of everybody knows you, but maybe the 5% who don't.
Thank you, Ambassador Hirsch, and thank you to Devon and to Mr. Otobo. My name is Mireille Afa, and I work for IPI. I have a question on the relationship between the UN peacebuilding architecture and the AU post-conflict and post-conflict reconstruction and development policy. Like, how does the UN peacebuilding architecture consider this policy from the AU? I think one of the reasons the policy was adopted, promoted, and I think now there's a African Solidarity Initiative going with it, was that there were not many countries on the peacebuilding commission agenda, and they wanted to support more peacebuilding efforts in the region. Like, is it something necessary? Is it like a diversion of efforts and resources that could be more or better targeted to peacebuilding efforts in Africa? Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is a very politically charged question.
Hang on one second. Hang on a second. Would anybody else like to come in here? I'm going to give her a chance to answer that too. Does anybody else want to come in here? So this is something that IPI has been seized with for well over a couple of years, how the AU and the UN can work better together on peace building, as well as kind of deployment of troops for these immediate objectives. So I'm going to treat this as your wrap-up comment here. So why don't you go first again, Devon, and then you'll go, Iviome, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I think Mr. Otobu probably has more detailed comments. All I guess I would say about the AU is looking at those frameworks. What's interesting to me is that fundamentally the conception of peace building underlying these documents is very similar to sort of the ideas about peace building at the UN or elsewhere, and so very much then informed by liberal conceptions of peace building. And to me that's interesting, because often you hear people talking about, well, we need to bring in the African perspectives, or we need to have kind of these different alternatives. And really, when you look at the this is an African, this is very similar to the kinds of ideas that are either at the UN or in various donor governments. So that's quite interesting to me.
Yes, there are three parts to response to your question. First of all, the Peacebuilding Commission has had very interesting dialogue with the AU Peace and Security Council. And the reason it was pitched at that level was that when the Africans created their PROCD, the post-conflict reconstruction, they also had something they were calling Ministerial Steering Committee, which would have been the equivalent of the PBC. But it has never taken off. So the dialogue that we are conducting now has been by default between the PBC and the Security Council. Secondly, when we went on the first visit to the AU, we here means the PBC, in 2009, the PBC, I mean, the Security Council, the AU PSC members did express the desire to have more African countries on the agenda of the Peacebuilding Commission, because they also knew that they will get more international support that way. But in parallel, in order to give effect to their own framework, they then did this ASI. And in fact, I can confirm that I was one of those that helped them in conceptualizing the ASI. The ASI, by the way, stands for the African Solidarity Initiative for Peacebuilding, which is something that brings together in one framework the equivalent of the PBC, the PBF, and what have you. And the whole idea is to share experiences among African countries and support other countries emerging from conflict. Now, but this is where my answer becomes a little bit controversial, which is that I think, quite frankly, that the AU is better off focusing on a few things that they can do well, rather than trying to replicate everything that the UN does. Why do I say that? There is a report, and I can email it. I'm sure you will have seen the report. The Center for Conflict Resolution, which is one of the partners for this book, issued a report last year, which is called the AU at 10, and it contained two very startling statistics there. One was that the AU relies on external funding for 94% of its peace and security work. And it then gave another statistics that the AU relies for 55% on external funding for what they call the core budget. In fact, after I read it, I wrote an email to the director, whom both Curtis and John Hirsch know, that these figures you have quoted, are they really accurate? And he replied me that, in fact, the figures could even be much higher. This is a point because I worked in Addis Ababa for 12 years before I came to New York. And one of the very provocative comments I made to my colleagues at the OAU, as it was then called, well, because there was this constant tension between the ECA that works on economic issues for Africa and the OAU, which was doing both political and economic. And I said, in fact, what I said then is even truer today than then. I said that if only the OAU, as it was then called, concentrated on political issues and left the economic for ECA and the financing for ADB, they will do Africa a lot of good. And in some ways, this study by the Center for Conflict Resolution confirms that. Yeah.
So this is kind of just the beginning of a very thoughtful set of issues. So I commend the book to all of you. I really want to thank you, Devon, and Eviome for coming here today and sharing your thoughts with us, and to thank all of you for being here. Let's give them all a big hand.